In the early years of the Pacific War, night belonged to the Japanese. It was their refuge, their weapon, and their most reliable shield. When the sun dipped below the black horizon and the islands of the Solomons or the Gilberts vanished into silhouettes, American air power, so fearsome by day, became nearly blind. Radar was primitive, searchlights unreliable, and fighter aircraft almost useless once darkness swallowed the sky. Every night, as the tropical heat sank into the runways of Henderson Field or the coral strips on Tarawa and Makin, American Marines and sailors braced for the same unwelcome sound, the distant drone of Japanese engines drifting out of the darkness like ghosts. They called them Washing Machine Charlie or Bed Check Charlie, a mix of nicknames for the solitary raiders and harassment bombers that kept the Americans awake with erratic engine sputters and sudden bursts of bombs dropped at random. But behind the nuisance raids came far more dangerous visitors. Twin-engine Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, Yokosuka D4Y Judy dive bombers, and even fast reconnaissance aircraft like the K-46 Dyna, all exploiting the fact that by night the Americans could do little more than fire blindly into the sky. Japanese air crews knew this. They planned their night raids with confidence because they understood the imbalance. By day, American F4F Wildcats, P-40 Warhawks, and later F4U Corsairs tore through Japanese formations with overwhelming firepower. But at night, the advantage reversed completely. The Japanese owned the dark. At Henderson Field in 1942 and 1943, the pattern became a ritual. The base shut down its lights, Marines huddled in slit trenches, anti-aircraft crews scanned the void with ears instead of eyes, and the drone of Japanese aircraft passed overhead unchallenged and unscathed. Sleep became a luxury. Every night ended the same way, anxious glances at the still smoldering bomb craters and the knowledge that the enemy would return as soon as dusk fell again. Commanders knew the situation was untenable. They needed a night fighter, something that could find, chase, and destroy Japanese aircraft in total darkness. The British had succeeded with their radar-equipped Beaufighters, and the U.S. Army Air Forces were experimenting with P-70s and early radar-equipped P-38s. But the Navy and Marine Corps had nothing reliable based in the islands, and the Japanese exploited that gap mercilessly. Their night harassment and bombing missions disrupted sleep, damaged aircraft, burned fuel dumps, and forced constant readiness. But more importantly, they struck at a psychological level. Americans were used to seeing the enemy. In the dark, they could not. So the Navy searched for a solution. It needed something fast, something powerful, something rugged enough to operate from primitive island airstrips, and, most importantly, something that could carry an airborne radar small enough to fit into a single-engine fighter. The answer arrived in late 1943 in the form of a modified Corsair unlike anything the Pacific had yet seen. It began in workshops at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, where engineers from Vought and the U.S. Navy carved open the sleek right wing of the F4U-1 Corsair to fit a compact radar unit known as AN/APS-6. This new radar, barely the size of a small oil drum, weighed little more than 80 pounds, but carried the power to detect aircraft at 4 to 5 miles, even in total darkness. For the first time, a single-engine Navy fighter could hunt at night. They called the new variant F4U-2. Only about 34 would ever be built, but in the vast Pacific, that small number would change the entire balance of night combat. Before they reached the front lines, the F4U-2s underwent trials stateside with experimental squadrons like VFN-75 and later VFN-101. Pilots who had never flown with radar before sat in darkened hangars, staring at unfamiliar scopes glowing with ghostly blips. They practiced blind approaches, intercept geometry, and target identification in a world without sunlight. Their teachers were Navy engineers, British night fighter veterans, and radar operators who understood that mastering these new routines meant the difference between victory and flying straight into an enemy's tail. Many pilots doubted at first. The Corsair was already a notoriously challenging aircraft to land on a carrier, and now they were supposed to fly it in pitch darkness, guided only by an 8-centimeter radar screen no larger than a watch wrist? Yet as training continued, the doubt began to fade. The APS-6 worked. It wasn't perfect, but it could see more than human eyes ever could, and it could guide a fighter directly onto a target invisible to anyone else. As 1943 drew to a close, the first F4U-2s deployed forward to the Solomons. They arrived quietly, no ceremony, no spotlight. Their arrival was overshadowed by the larger events of the war: the push into the Central Pacific, the island-hopping campaigns, the long, grinding fights on Bougainville and New Georgia. But the Marines and sailors trying to survive those nightly raiding runs noticed the new aircraft immediately. The F4U-2 stood out even in the darkness. The radar pod bulged beneath its right wing. Its exhaust stacks were modified to reduce the bright flash of .50 caliber tracers, and its pilots walked with the same weary determination as the bomber crews they would soon protect. Their mission was simple: end Japanese freedom of movement at night. No more unchallenged bomb runs. No more harassing raiders. No more Charlie buzzing airfields at 3 a.m., laughing through the darkness with sputtering engines. The night belonged to the Japanese. The F4U-2 Corsair was going to take it back.
The decision to turn the Corsair into a night fighter did not come from a grand strategic plan. It came from necessity, from sleepless islands, from exhausted Marines listening to Japanese engines circling above them in the dark. The Navy needed a predator that could hunt in night's blindness, and they needed it fast. In the summer and fall of 1943, engineers at the Naval Aircraft Factory in Vought took the already formidable F4U-1 Corsair and began stripping it down, reshaping it, and rebuilding it into a weapon designed for a battlefield where the human eye was useless. The heart of the transformation was a radar, the AN-APS-6, a compact X-band radar set originally tested in experimental night fighter programs on the East Coast. Compared to the bulky systems used by British twin-engine fighters, APS-6 was revolutionary, lightweight, simple enough for a single pilot to use, and small enough to be tucked inside a streamlined fiberglass radome mounted on the Corsair's starboard wing. But installing the radar was only the beginning. Engineers had to remove one of the 6 Browning .50 caliber guns to make space for wiring and power conduits. They rerouted electrical systems, reinforced parts of the wing, and installed new cockpit instruments, a small round radar scope placed just below eye level where a pilot could glance at it without losing sight of his flight path. The Corsair's already tight cockpit became even tighter, crowded with new switches, dimmable red lighting, and a radar control panel designed for hands trained to fly, fight, and navigate in total darkness. They also modified the exhaust to reduce visible flames during night firing, fitted flame dampeners, and applied a darker overall paint scheme, glossy sea blue, to help the aircraft vanish into the night sky. What emerged from the workshops was not simply a Corsair, it was a new species of fighter, purpose-built to stalk and destroy. While engineers pushed metal and circuitry to their limits, the pilots chosen for the new night fighter squadrons were undergoing their own transformation. Many came from VFN-75, the Navy's first night fighter squadron, and from the newly formed VFN-101. Others were Marine aviators with combat experience in the Solomons, but no radar training whatsoever. Now, in dim briefing rooms at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, they learned how to read the glowing blip of a radar contact, how to interpret range rate changes, how to approach a target they could not see, and how to position themselves for a kill without colliding with the enemy or with friendly aircraft. They flew practice intercepts against Navy PB-4Y patrol bombers and SBD Dauntless dive bombers, learning to trust the tiny green dot on the scope more than their own senses. Blind approaches,
radar homing, target closure calculations. It all had to be done alone, in the cockpit, while flying a machine famous for torque, speed, and unforgiving handling at low airspeeds. The pilots soon realized that night fighting demanded a different mind, a different discipline. Day combat rewarded aggression and instinct. Night combat rewarded patience, calculation, and nerves of steel. There was no horizon at night, no moonlit clouds, just darkness pressing in from every angle. The Corsair's engine drummed like a heartbeat. The radar scope flickered with the faintest movement. And somewhere out there, invisible in the void, an enemy bomber crept toward an American airfield. In December 1943, the first F4U-2s began deploying to the Pacific, carried aboard escort carriers, or ferried through island chains to bases carved from jungle and coral. When they arrived on Esperance, Bougainville, and later Tarawa and Roinamor, the ground crews crowded around the strange-looking Corsairs. The bulging radome, offset gun layout, and extra antennae made the F4U-2 look slightly asymmetrical, but its mission was perfectly centered. The night belonged to the Japanese, but the Americans finally had a hunter built for the dark. The pilots of VFN-75 were among the first to go operational. They had trained under Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare, Medal of Honor recipient and architect of the Navy's earliest night tactics, before he was lost at sea during a night intercept mission. O'Hare's vision shaped the doctrine they carried with them: radar-directed intercept from ground controllers, followed by APS-6 acquisition in the final miles, then a slashing .50 caliber attack launched from a position the enemy never saw coming. When the F4U-2 pilots flew their first night defensive patrols over the Solomons, they discovered instantly that the battlefield had changed. Radar stations like SCR-270 and SCR-527 tracked incoming Japanese aircraft, handing vectors to the Corsairs in the air. The pilots climbed through starlit skies, black enough to feel solid, their cockpit gauges dimmed to a ghostly red glow. And then, on the scope, a faint dot appeared. The enemy was no longer an unseen terror. He was a contact, a vector, a target. Pilots who had once stared into empty night now leaned toward the scope, adrenaline rushing as the dot brightened with each passing second. They eased their throttles forward, timed their turns, adjusted altitude, and prepared to fight an enemy they would not see until the moment their tracers reached him. The arrival of the F4U-2 did not make headlines. It did not immediately erase the impact of months of Japanese night raids. But it represented something new, something decisive, a shift in who owned the night. And as the first radar-equipped Corsairs taxied down the crushed coral runways of the frontline islands, the men who had spent too many sleepless nights listening to enemy engines finally felt hope. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Americans had a weapon designed not just to survive the darkness, but to dominate it.
The first real test came on a moonless night in early January 1944, when the humid air over the Solomons hung so still that sound seemed to travel for miles. At 23:47, the ground radar station at Cape Esperance picked up what the operators initially thought was weather clutter. Then the movement resolved into a familiar pattern: steady, deliberate, closing from the northwest. A formation of Japanese T-4M Betty bombers, flying low over the water to avoid detection, was heading straight for the American perimeter at Bougainville. Only months earlier, such a sighting would have triggered a resigned routine. Anti-aircraft guns would brace, searchlights would probe futilely into the night, and Marines on the ground would curse as another sleepless raid began. But this time, the Americans had an answer. The controller keyed his microphone and spoke the words that changed the pattern of Pacific nights. Night intercept, Vector 220, Angel 6, Scramble Corsairs.
On the flight line, two dark blue F4U-2s of VFN-75 roared to life, their flame-dampened exhausts glowing faintly like smoldering coals. The pilots, Lieutenant Harvey Nightmare Parker and Ensign Frank Wicks, had been dozing in their tents moments earlier. Now they sprinted across the tarmac, strapped in, advanced throttles, and launched into the blackness. The night swallowed them instantly. No horizon, no starlight through the jungle canopy, just the shrieking wind and the cold glow of red-lit instruments. At 3,000 feet, the controller guided them in with firm, clipped updates. Bogies now bearing 215, closing at high speed, range 8 miles. Parker's hand moved to the APS-6 switch. The cockpit filled with a soft hum. The radar scope bloomed to life, tenuous at first, then sharpening into a distinct pulsing dot. It felt unreal. For months, the enemy had been a rumor in the darkness. Now he had form and position. "Contact," Parker radioed quietly. "Single large target, possible multiple." Parker eased his Corsair into a gentle climb, cutting across the predicted path of the incoming bombers, careful not to outrun his own radar cone. The dot on the scope grew brighter, larger. Range 4 miles, 3 miles, 2. He still couldn't see anything out the canopy, just infinite black. He felt rather than saw Wicks's F4U-2 sliding into position on his right. "Switching to guns," Parker said. The Corsair vibrated slightly as the arming solenoids clicked into place. At 1.5 miles, a faint glint appeared ahead, moonlight reflecting off something metallic. Then suddenly a shape emerged, a long-winged Betty silhouetted against the distant shimmer of the sea. Parker pushed the throttle forward and closed. He knew the Betty crews had no radar. They had no idea death was on their tail. He lined up, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. 5 streams of .50 caliber tracers erupted from his left wing, arcing into the night like burning comets. They tore into the Betty's right engine. The bomber lurched left, flames blooming along its fuselage. A second burst ripped through the cockpit. The Betty disintegrated into a fireball and vanished into the jungle below. Silence. For a heartbeat, he heard nothing but his own breathing. Then Wicks's voice broke through. "Second target, breaking right." The ground radar had been correct. The Japanese raid was not a single bomber, but a small formation. Wicks rolled hard, banking so sharply the G-forces squeezed the air from his lungs. His radar picked up a fast-moving contact trying to escape south. He descended, following the blip downward until he saw the faint, insect-like outline of another Betty dropping toward treetop level to evade him. Wicks dove after it. The black ocean rushed up beneath him. His eyes strained in the dark. No light, no moon, only the faint shape growing clearer by the second. At 400 yards, he fired a long burst. Tracers stitched across the bomber's port engine, cutting it open in a shower of fiery debris. The Betty wobbled, lost lift, and plunged straight into the water with a towering splash. 2 kills, 2 bombers that would have reached the American lines unopposed just a few weeks earlier. Back at Henderson Field, the anti-aircraft guns waited for explosions that never came. At first, officers assumed the Japanese had simply changed direction. Then came the radio transmission. 2 Bettys destroyed. Area clear. The operations tent erupted in applause. Marines who had spent months waking to midnight bombs cheered. Some simply stared in disbelief. On that night, the routine had been broken, but this was only the beginning.
Over the next weeks, the F4U-2s flew almost nightly. They intercepted Ki-46 Dyna recon aircraft, whose crews flying fast and high once believed themselves untouchable. Now they watched tracers rise from nowhere and had seconds to react before the Corsairs shredded them with angled radar-guided attacks. On February 14th, Lieutenant Nolan E. Marshall scored a kill against a Japanese bomber that radar tracked at 9,000 feet approaching from the north. Marshall's APS-6 guided him through a pitch-black intercept. He never saw the bomber until his tracers lit its tail. It exploded in a cascade of burning fuel and vanished into the jungle below. Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMF-N 532 soon joined the hunt, deploying to the Marshalls from aircraft carriers and building on Navy tactics. Their pilots refined new techniques, running intercepts with ground-based SCR-527 radar, using low-altitude approaches to avoid detection, and coordinating two F4U hunter-killer teams to trap bombers between converging vectors. Japanese air crews were stunned. They had built their night strategy on one assumption, that the Americans were blind. The F4U-2 Corsair, armed with a glowing radar scope, 550 caliber guns, and a pilot who had learned to fight without sight, had drawn first blood in a new kind of war.
By the spring of 1944, the F4U-2 Corsair was no longer an experiment whispered about in radar shacks and intelligence briefings. It was a presence, a force, a shadow in the night sky the Japanese crews had begun to fear. The first kills in the Solomons had proven the concept. Now, as American forces surged across the Central Pacific toward the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas, the radar-equipped Corsair matured into something far more deadly, a fully integrated night defense weapon system. The turning point came with the arrival of the U.S. Marine Corps Night Fighter Squadrons, VMF-N 532, and later VMF-N 533, who deployed their F4U-2s to newly captured atolls and coral airstrips carved out of the jungles. These Marines did not simply fly the aircraft. They refined the doctrine, sharpened the tactics, and built the first coordinated night air defense network the Pacific Theater had ever seen. On tiny islands like Tarawa, Macon, Majuro, and Roy Namur, radar trucks, SCR-270, SCR-527, and even the older SCR-268 sets set up around the perimeter, their skeletal antennae spinning under starlight. Operators huddled over scopes in sweltering tents, plotting contacts with grease pencils on plexiglass boards, handing vectors to Corsair pilots orbiting silently above. The F4U-2 pilots responded with precision. They flew dark, no navigation lights, no cockpit glare, nothing but the glow of their red-lit instruments and the faint pulse of the APS-6 radar scope. The shift in tactics was dramatic. Instead of scrambling fighters only after bombers were already over the target, commanders began launching F4U-2s before Japanese aircraft arrived, placing them at carefully calculated intercept points based on expected enemy routes. Pilots flew racetrack patterns at 8,000 to 12,000 feet, listening to controllers call out range and bearing. A typical interception went like this. Radar stations tracked incoming Japanese aircraft, often G-4M Betty bombers or Nakajima B-5N torpedo planes flying nocturnal harassment or reconnaissance missions. Controllers issued vectors to the Corsair. The pilot turned toward the invisible threat, switched on the APS-6, and searched for the faint green blip that marked a target. Once detected, he closed from below or astern, climbing gently to avoid silhouetting himself against the horizon. At 1,000 yards, he might catch a faint shape, a shadow, a glint of metal, then squeeze the trigger. A burst of .50 caliber fire tore into the bomber, and the Japanese crew never understood how death had found them in absolute darkness. One of the most successful Marine night fighter aces, Lieutenant Hugh O'Neill of VMF-N 532, became a legend during this period. His radar-guided interceptions over the Marshall Islands were textbook perfect. On the night of March 15, 1944, O'Neill downed the G4M approaching Roy Namur at 9,500 feet after tracking it from 5 miles away. He attacked again 2 nights later, intercepting a fast-moving K-46 Dyna reconnaissance aircraft, a notoriously difficult target, by diving through a cloud layer and using radar alone to maintain lock. His after-action report described the moment he broke through the clouds and saw the Dyna silhouetted against the sea. Target appeared exactly where the scope placed him. Closed to 200 yards. Fired 1 burst. Enemy aircraft exploded. The Japanese quickly realized that their night advantage had evaporated. Reports from surviving crews described enemy aircraft with unseen approach and American fighters appearing without lights impossible to evade. Some crews believed the Americans had developed supernatural vision. Others suspected airborne radar, an idea so shocking that at first it was dismissed as impossible. But the truth became undeniable as losses mounted. On Saipan, Tinian, and Guam during the Marianas Campaign in mid-1944, Japanese night raids suffered heavy attrition. F4U-2s flying from forward fields intercepted dozens of aircraft attempting to harass American troops or sabotage runway construction efforts. In one remarkable series of engagements, VFN-101 Corsairs operating from the carrier USS Enterprise CV-6 provided night cover for Task Force 58 during operations around the Marshalls. Radar-guided F4U-2s patrolled the darkness above the fleet, intercepting incoming Japanese raiders before they could even sight the silhouettes of American carriers. Pilots described the eerie feeling of hunting over the open ocean. No land beneath, no lights, only the black void and the soft heartbeat of the radar. But the kills came all the same. Japanese B-5N torpedo bombers attempting low-altitude night approaches were detected at short ranges by the APS-6. Corsairs dove, fired, and vanished into the dark again, leaving only burning wreckage on the waves. Through mid-1944, the night fighters refined new tactics. Low intercept arcs, approaching enemy aircraft from beneath to avoid being silhouetted against the horizon. 2-fighter hunter-killer teams. 1 aircraft locked the target with radar, while the second remained lights off, watching for visual contact. Silent intercepts. No radio calls once within 1 mile of the target to prevent Japanese radio operators from detecting voice transmissions. Cross-vector traps. Corsairs approaching from converging angles to box in evasive bombers. These techniques turned night from a Japanese asset into a Japanese liability. The enemy, once confident in their darkness, now flew knowing they were being watched by unseen predators. Japanese air activity at night decreased noticeably in sectors protected by F4U-2 units. The psychological effect on ground troops was immediate. Marines on islands long haunted by nightly bombings found themselves sleeping through entire nights for the first time in months. Anti-aircraft crews stopped firing blindly into the sky. Searchlights stayed cold. The night became quiet. American commanders noticed the deeper strategic impact. With Japanese night raids neutralized, construction battalions, CBs, could work longer hours building airfields. Supply dumps no longer needed nightly relocation. Forward operating bases became safer. And, most importantly, the carriers of the fast carrier task forces could now maintain round-the-clock flight operations without the constant threat of nocturnal torpedo or dive bomber attacks. All of this from barely 30 dozen radar-equipped Corsairs. Their presence rewrote the balance of night power in the Pacific. And as 1944 progressed, the Japanese would realize that the darkness they once controlled now hid a new master, an unseen hunter with bent wings and a green, glowing eye that pierced the night. By late 1944, long before the war ended, veterans on island airstrips and sailors on rolling carrier decks
began speaking of a strange, almost eerie phenomenon. The night had gone quiet. Not everywhere, not instantly, but wherever the F4U-2 Corsair appeared, Japanese night raids, the once endless cycle of harassment bombing, reconnaissance flights, and nerve-shredding washing machine Charlie passes, began to evaporate. It was not the kind of silence born from peace. It was the quiet that follows when a predator enters the dark. The results were measurable. Radar logs from the Marshalls and Marianas showed a steep drop in successful Japanese night penetrations in any sector patrolled by F4U-2 Corsairs. Mission reports from VMF-N532, VMF-N533, VF-N75, and VF-N101 documented kill after kill, G4M Bettys caught in mid-approach, Ki-46 Dynas ambushed high over the water, B-5N torpedo planes shattered before they could descend toward the black shapes of American ships. Yet the impact extended far beyond the tally. The Japanese perspective, darkness lost. For the Japanese, the change was devastating. Their entire night strategy, harassment, psychological warfare, and nighttime reconnaissance relied on a simple assumption: American forces could not see in the dark. That assumption had been true from 1942 through much of 1943. At Guadalcanal, the Japanese exploited it ruthlessly. But by 1944, their pilots were reporting something far more frightening. The enemy appears where no eyes can see. In several surviving combat diaries, Japanese bomber crews describe being attacked without warning, without silhouette, without even the glimmer of a wing against the horizon. One G4M navigator wrote after barely escaping an intercept over the Marshalls, "We saw nothing, only tracers, like lightning from the darkness." Rumors spread quickly. Some thought the Americans had developed supernatural eyesight. Others believed the Corsair had a device that detected sound waves or engine heat. A few guessed correctly: airborne radar. But the truth did not matter as much as the effect. By the end of 1944, Japanese night operations shifted from confidence to caution and eventually toward avoidance. In every region where radar-equipped Corsairs appeared, the Japanese curtailed night raids, restricted reconnaissance flights, and redirected their limited aircraft to areas where they believed the Americans were still blind. Darkness, once their greatest ally, had betrayed them. The American side. A new way of war. For American forces fighting on the islands, the arrival of the F4U-2 meant something simpler and far more tangible: sleep. Marines on Tarawa, Macon, and Roenamur, men who had spent months jolting awake to midnight bomb blasts, found themselves sleeping through the night for the first time in the campaign. Seabees working on runways no longer carried the constant dread of a sudden invisible Betty emerging from the clouds. Radar men no longer watched helplessly as blips passed overhead without a single friendly aircraft able to intercept. And carrier task forces, particularly the hard-fighting groups around USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga, finally had a shield against nocturnal torpedo attacks. Even destroyer captains, long tormented by night-flying scouts that radioed convoy positions, began to trust that the sky above them was no longer an open door for the enemy. The F4U-2 had given the Navy something it had never possessed before: true, reliable night-air superiority. Why so few made such a big impact? Only around 34 F4U-2 Corsairs were ever built, an astonishingly small number given their outsized effect. But the secret was the radar, the APS-6. While small, it was decades ahead of Japanese technology. Its X-band frequency, 4 to 5 mile range, and ability to lock on to aircraft with remarkable fidelity allowed a single pilot to operate in conditions no Japanese fighter or bomber could match. Just as importantly, The Navy and Marine Corps built an entire framework around these aircraft: ground-based radar, coordinated intercept stations, and new night fighting doctrines, ensuring that the F4U-2 was not merely a night fighter, but the centerpiece of a new system of night warfare. In this environment, even a handful of radar Corsairs could dominate hundreds of square miles of sky. Transition and evolution. By late 1944, a new generation of night fighters began to appear: the F6F3N and F6F5N Hellcats, and later the enhanced F4U5N and F4U5NL. These newer models carried improved radar sets, longer range, and even greater firepower. But all of them owed their existence, doctrine, and training lineage to the small batch of F4U-2s that first proved the concept. As Admiral Chester Nimitz later wrote in a post-war assessment of night fighting capability, the success of the F4U-2 gave us the confidence to pursue night operations on a fleet scale. Night combat would never again be a secondary thought. Memory and legacy. The pilots who flew the F4U-2 belonged to a unique brotherhood. They trained in isolation, fought alone, and often landed on unlit runways guided only by radio and instinct. Their missions were invisible to most of the men they served alongside. Their victories were often heard but never seen. Yet the impact they had was immeasurable. They broke the back of Japan's night harassment strategy. They protected carriers when the fleet needed them most. They made island airfields safe enough for round-the-clock operations. And they turned darkness, a space long owned by the enemy, into territory patrolled by American wings. And they did it with a handful of aircraft, a glowing radar scope, and the courage to fight an enemy they could not see except as a flicker on a phosphor screen. When historians write about the great fighters of the Pacific, Hellcats, Corsairs, Wildcats, they often speak of daylight victories, of dogfights in blue skies. But in the shadows of the night war, the F4U-2 Corsair stood alone. It was the first American single-engine fighter to truly conquer the dark. It was the aircraft that made the Japanese fear the night. And it was the machine that proved that in the Pacific, even the blackest sky could belong to the hunter if he carried a radar that pierced the void.